Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and today we're going to be discussing a novel called Old Mortality by Katherine Anne Porter from 1937. Now, this is, I would say, one of the, not an obscure novel necessarily, but one of the less well-known novels that we've discussed so far on this podcast. A lot of the other books that we've touched on and talked about are in many ways quite famous. Old Mortality, I would argue, is a canonical work of English literature, and Katherine Anne Porter is herself a canonical author. She's more famous, maybe, for some of her other novels, like Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and Ship of Fools. We'll discuss both of those eventually in the future, but I want to start with Old Mortality, 1937, because I think it's a great entry into her style of writing, and it's a very well-structured short novel. Sometimes I think it's mistakenly labeled as a short story, but it's too long to be a short story. You could call it a novella, if you'd like, but I think it's fine to simply call it a novel. It is a short novel, but it has all the hallmarks of a great classic novel. And as we're going to talk about, it's a very intelligently structured novel, composed of 3 parts that trace the coming of age of the protagonist, Miranda. And we're going to look at how the 3 parts of the novel do that, look at some select passages, of course. Now, one thing I like when it comes to discussing a novel like this and a writer like Katherine Anne Porter is because people might be less familiar with her, because she's less of a cultural phenomenon than someone like F. Scott Fitzgerald or Oscar Wilde. We don't necessarily have to contend with all the cultural baggage that often gets associated with literature. You know, as I've said before, sometimes when people approach novels, they have a sense of all this outside external stuff that they need to bring to the novel. And sometimes that stuff gets in the way of actually reading the text. This is something we talked about a lot in the podcast on The Great Gatsby from a few weeks ago, when one of the problems with reading Gatsby, is that people think they know Gatsby, and they bring that prior knowledge to their understanding of the text. When in reality, as I've said, if you focus on the text itself, sometimes you're surprised at what you discover. Well, in this case, right, with Old Mortality, we don't have too much cultural baggage we necessarily need to wade through. We can focus a lot on the text itself, because I think people might not be super familiar with the novel. My recommendation is, before you listen to this podcast, go read the novel. It's a short novel. You can read it in one sitting, and I think it'll help you kind of understand. It'll enliven our discussion here if you've read this novel beforehand, especially because it's so short and so easy to read. So, Katherine Anne Porter, a few things about who she is as a writer, just to give some context, right? So she was born in 1890, died in 1980. So she is a writer associated with a period we call modernism. But as we're going to see, her style of writing is not exactly like a lot of the people we think of as modernist writers, people like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce with their stream of consciousness style, and certainly not someone like William Faulkner, who she's often compared with, because they were both Southern writers. So Katherine Anne Porter was a writer from the American South. She was born in Texas, and many of her stories are set across the American South and deal with the transition of kind of the old classic South, right? The old South of legends and myths from the Civil War, into the transition of that world into the 20th century. And that's one of the big themes of Old Mortality. The young Miranda grows up hearing stories of the old glamorous South. And over the course of the novel, she learns how to reject and push back against those stories and those expectations, and to define herself on her own terms, as we're going to see. So you can think of Katherine Anne Porter as a Southern writer. You can think of her as a modernist. I think both of those are valid descriptions. In terms of modernism, even though her style doesn't quite match a lot of the other modernist writers who I just mentioned and who we'll discuss on this podcast, she is a modernist in the sense that she's dealing with the transition into the 20th century, into modernity, And because Old Mortality also deals with the development of an individual's subjectivity, right, and subjective experience and understanding of the world. And I do think that counts as modernism, that counts as a modernist theme. So I want to briefly talk about the overall structure of the novel, Old Mortality, before we dive into some of the early passages, because I think one of the things that this novel does so well is its structure. So it's 3 parts. Part 1 is set in 1885 to 1902. And in this part, Miranda is young. She's, I think, 8 years old. And this is when she's first hearing stories of her Aunt Amy, who's the other kind of major animating figure in the story, right, in the novel. This glamorous Southern belle, right, whose untimely death basically haunts the pages of this story. And, of course, Aunt Amy's husband, the man who loves her, who's referred to as Uncle Gabriel. And so these 2 characters are first introduced in part 1, and in part 1, Miranda is basically enamored by these old stories. Part 2, meanwhile, is set in 1904. So Miranda is slightly older, so she's 10 years old in 1904, so she's still a child, but this is now a pivotal moment in her life, a pivotal moment of transformation. And this part features, right, a scene in which she meets her Uncle Gabriel again when he's older, and the romanticism of her early ideas of who he was essentially vanish with the second meeting, and we'll look at that scene in detail. And then part 3 of the novel is set in 1912. So Miranda is now 18. She's essentially an adult now. She's married, and this final part is set as she travels back to her home for the funeral of her Uncle Gabriel. And so the structure of the novel essentially follows these 2 parallel tracks. One track is Miranda's own coming of age, as she transforms between the ages of 8 and 18, and the other is the story of Uncle Gabriel and Aunt Amy, these 2 tragic old Southern figures who she hears stories about and whose romanticism gradually fades for Miranda. And we're going to look at how that's done. But that essentially is the kind of brilliant and wonderful structure that Katherine Ann Porter uses to tell this story. And as I say a lot in my creative writing classes, I think a novel needs to be intelligently structured. Some people are really interested in this idea of writing a novel on the fly, writing a novel without the thought of structure. I think it's because when we read novels, we sometimes like to imagine that they are these spontaneous creations of an author's genius. I think because we have this idea of genius as something that does not coincide with hard work, that does not require hard work, but is intuitive. That somehow a writer can sit down and intuitively write out a novel, a perfectly structured novel. Now, here's the thing. A novelist late in their career maybe could do this, right? Maybe they've read and written so many stories that they could sit down and intuitively write out a novel that will have an intelligent structure. But more often than not, novelists must structure and outline their work beforehand. They have to have a sense of the pieces before it all comes together. This is something I really always emphasize to my own students, is that structure is one of the most essential skills to master when it comes to writing a novel. Katherine Ann Porter clearly mastered the art of structure because Old Mortality is so well structured through these 3 parts. Essentially, she chooses 3 key moments from Miranda's life that give this life the narrative shape that she wants. And that's not an easy thing to do, but she does it so well. And we're going to look at the moments she chooses and kind of analyze and think about why she chooses these moments. All right, so I think the best way to begin here is just to look at the very beginning. And the opening passage gives us a really good sense into what this novel is going to be about, and also the prose style of Katherine Ann Porter, which, as we're going to see, is a very careful and sophisticated prose style, very well constructed and mannered, classical in a lot of ways, but as we're going to see, with these touches of modernism, right, with these gestures towards a kind of 20th century modernist emphasis on subjectivity. So the novel opens with a description of Aunt Amy. She was a spirited-looking young woman, with dark curly hair cropped and parted on the side, a short oval face with straight eyebrows and a large curved mouth. A round white collar rose from the neck of her tightly buttoned black basque, and round white cuffs set off lazy hands with dimples in them, lying at ease in the folds of her flounced skirt, which gathered around to a bustle. She sat thus, forever in the pose of being photographed, a motionless image in her dark walnut frame with silver oak leaves in the corners, her smiling gray eyes following one about the room. It was a reckless, indifferent smile, rather disturbing to her nieces Maria and Miranda. Quite often, they wondered why every older person who looked at the picture said, "How lovely," and why everyone who had known her thought her so beautiful and charming. So we begin with this photograph, right? We begin with this photograph. And look at the phrases and the words that Katherine Ann Porter chooses to emphasize this photograph of Aunt Amy. It's emphasized that she is a spirited-looking young woman. That's the main quality that we're going to associate with Aunt Amy. Spirited, right? She's a spirited young woman. But the emphasis here is that Miranda and Maria are, at this point, they don't find the image necessarily romantic. If anything, it says they find it disturbing, right? Disturbing. And they kind of wonder, there seems to be a discrepancy between the stories they hear from people about Aunt Amy and the photograph itself. They don't find the photograph beautiful and charming, but the stories that they hear emphasize that Aunt Amy was beautiful and charming. So already we begin the novel with this tension between the actual image of Aunt Amy, what does she actually look like to the young girls, and the stories that are told about her. This is the central tension of the novel, romanticism versus realism. What does she actually look like in the photograph versus what do the stories say about her? How does she seem to the girls in the stories? The other thing I think it's important to emphasize here is that Miranda is our protagonist, but at the beginning of the novel, she's not really differentiated from her sister Maria. In fact, Miranda and Maria in the first part of the novel almost appear as one unit, right? Their interpretations of the stories about their aunt, it's essentially that both of them, right, are listening and hearing and observing and noting. It's only later that Miranda really comes to differentiate herself from her sister Maria. But if you think about it, if this is a coming-of-age story, that makes complete sense. Because when you're young, you do have a kind of common identity with your siblings, especially if you have a sibling who's very close in age. People treat you like a unit sometimes, and people seem to treat Maria and Miranda here like a unit, like one person. And it's only later when you discover your sense of self that you detach yourself, right? That you develop a kind of independence and individuality. And that's kind of the process that we're going to see. Maria is not a very significant character in the novel, except as a part of Miranda when they were young girls, who Miranda detaches herself from as she kind of individuates herself over the course of the novel. So then let's just look at the next paragraph, because I think the next paragraph continues Katherine Ann Porter's wonderful writing. There was a kind of faded merriment in the background, with its vase of flowers and draped velvet curtains. The kind of vase and the kind of curtains no one would have anymore. The clothes were not even romantic looking, but merely most terribly out of fashion, and the whole affair was associated, in the minds of the little girls, with dead things. The smell of grandmother's medicated cigarettes and her furniture that smelled of beeswax, and her old-fashioned perfume, orange flower. The woman in the picture had been Aunt Amy, but she was only a ghost in a frame, in a sad, pretty story from old times. She had been beautiful, much loved, unhappy, and she had died young. So those final lines, I think, very curtly and succinctly introduce us, right, to who Aunt Amy is. But notice the other details in the paragraph, right? The emphasis here is that when they look at the photograph, they don't actually find it beautiful or romantic. They associate it with their grandmother, the smell of their grandmother's medicated cigarettes, the furniture of beeswax, the old-fashioned perfume, right? To the little girls, when they see the actual image of Aunt Amy, She doesn't seem beautiful. She doesn't seem romantic. As we're going to see, it's not the image that brings the sense of romance, it's the stories. One more paragraph I want to read, just at the next paragraph, which I think sets up who Miranda and Maria are and their kind of relationship to the past. So the very next paragraph, Maria and Miranda, aged 12 and 8 years, knew they were young, though they felt they had lived a long time. They had lived not only their own years, but their memories, it seemed to them, began years before they were born, in the lives of the grown-ups around them, old people above 40, most of them, who had a way of insisting that they too had been young once. It was hard to believe. So we sort of are brought into, kind of amusingly, right, humorously, into the heads of Maria and Miranda, kind of that general impression that young people have that children have when they look at older people and wonder, could these older people have been young like us once? But the emphasis here, I think, the important line is that Miranda and Maria, they feel as though they've lived a long time because the memories include the years before they were born, the lives of the grown-ups around them. And that's really important because what we're essentially saying here about Miranda and Maria too, right, is that they are connected to the past. They are connected to these old figures, old grown-ups, right, whose own lives are part of Miranda's life. And one of the things we're going to see, the trajectory that Miranda goes on, is separating herself from this past, right? In becoming an individual and becoming herself, she has to push away this past. She has to reject this past. I mean, in a way, that is modernity. That is modernism. Kind of pushing away the past, making a new start, a new individual subjectivity separated from all of the anxieties of your parents' generation. That's the process that we're going to see Miranda undergo over the course of this novel. And it's set up right away in the third paragraph. Again, think of what that says about Katherine Ann Porter's sense of structure. This is not a novel that comes to her intuitively, that she just writes and sees where it goes. This is a novel that she structures and layers with these little details, with these little moments that are going to resonate later when we reach the ending. It points to what I've been saying all the time in my classes, that novels are not intuitive creations. Novels are not intuitive creations that come just fully formed from your mind. They are creations that you structure. They are creations that you think about and outline and order. They don't just kind of emerge from your fingertips onto the document. Okay, so if we jump ahead a little bit, right, I want to sort of look at a few other details in this opening section that really set up the way Miranda and Maria think about and connect to their Aunt Amy and her story, right, with Uncle Gabriel. I want to look down kind of the next few pages in the middle of this paragraph that starts with, if Maria and Miranda were very quiet, because there's this again, this emphasis that Katherine Ann Porter does here, where she emphasizes that Miranda, again, doesn't really connect to the objects, the photographs, but rather to the stories. So this is a line that begins a few lines into the paragraph when the girls are looking at these objects from the past. The little girls examined the objects one by one and did not find them in themselves impressive. Such dowdy little wreaths and necklaces, some of them made of pearly shells, such moth-eaten bunches of pink ostrich feathers for the hair, such clumsy big breast pins and bracelets of gold and colored enamel, such silly-looking combs, standing up on tall teeth capped with seed pearls and French paste. Miranda, without knowing why, felt melancholy. It seemed such a pity that these faded things, these yellowed long gloves and misshapen satin slippers, these broad ribbons cracking where they were folded, should have been all those vanished girls had to decorate themselves with. And where were they now, those girls, and the boys in the odd-looking collars? The young men seemed even more unreal than the girls, with their high-buttoned coats, their puffy neckties, their waxed mustaches, their waving thick hair combed carefully over their foreheads. Who could have taken them seriously, looking like that? No, Maria and Miranda found it impossible to sympathize with those young persons, sitting rather stiffly before the camera, hopelessly out of fashion. But they were drawn and held by the mysterious love of the living, who remembered and cherished these dead. The visible remains were nothing. They were dust, perishable as the flesh. The features stamped on paper and metal were nothing. But their living memory enchanted the little girls. They listened, all ears and eager minds, picking here and there among the floating ends of narrative, patching together as well as they could fragments of tales that were like bits of poetry or music. Indeed, were associated with the poetry they had heard or read, with music, with the theater. So that's an essential passage that sets up, again, that dichotomy between realism and romanticism, and kind of the power of these old stories on these young girls. The point is that when they see the actual objects, and again, just to emphasize, notice how beautifully Katherine Ann Porter writes. What did I say earlier, right? She writes with this kind of careful, mannered, elegant, classical style. When she lists objects, she does so carefully and with precision. This is not the sort of fluid, wild writing style of Jack Kerouac or Thomas Pynchon. This is a classically elegant style of writing in which Katherine Ann Porter very carefully orders her sentences. And I think, as I said earlier, that sense of order, that sense of precision is also reflected in the macrocosm of the novel, right? The way she structures the whole thing. So we see both on the individual sentence level and on the large-scale narrative structure level, Katherine Ann Porter's mastery of order and structure and the care which she takes to craft and structure the whole thing. But what is the emphasis here? What is the point of these sentences? Maria and Miranda don't connect with the objects. They find the objects old-fashioned. When they look at the objects, they can't empathize with these old people from the past, with these old family members. But when they hear the stories, when they hear what Katherine Ann Porter calls the living memory of these people, then they are enchanted. And notice how she says, these stories of the living memory, they seemed to them like poetry, music, and theater, right? They associate them with these kind of glamorous artistic forms. And so again, it emphasizes the romanticism of these stories for the little girls. The stories do what the objects cannot. The objects make these people from the past seem cold, lifeless, right? Not some people that you can't empathize with. But when they hear the stories, then they empathize, then they connect. And so what is the story, right? What is the central story here that Miranda is enchanted by? It's the story of Aunt Amy, and specifically the story of the kind of love story between Aunt Amy and Uncle Gabriel. And so let's look at some sections where we sort of introduce the two of them. First of all, there's this description of Aunt Amy as people remember her. They ask, "Was she really beautiful, Uncle Bill? As an angel, my child." And so the emphasis there is that, Aunt Amy is beautiful. But remember, we started with this photograph. We started with this actual image of Aunt Amy. And the emphasis was that the girls didn't find her beautiful in the photograph. And so again, there's this tension between what does she actually look like to the girls in the photograph and what are the stories that the grown-ups in their life tell them about Aunt Amy. And this tension is going to be important, especially as we move forward, right? The tension between romanticism and realism. Now, beauty is really important to Miranda because Aunt Amy is consistently described as beautiful. And Miranda is essentially, what does she sort of feel in this opening section? She wants to be beautiful as well. It says here basically that she persisted in believing that by some miracle she would grow into a tall, cream-colored brunette like Cousin Isabel. So she wants to grow up to be beautiful. This cousin of hers, Cousin Isabel, is described as looking a lot like Amy. And Amy is contrasted here with another cousin, Eva. So let's talk about Eva here. I want to talk about her here because she's going to become important, obviously, in part 3 of the novel. But notice what's emphasized when she's introduced. Eva, shy and chinless, straining her upper lip over 2 enormous teeth, would sit in corners watching her mother. She looked hungry. Her eyes were strained and tired. She wore her mother's old clothes, made over, and taught Latin in a female seminary. She believed in votes for women and had traveled about making speeches. So the emphasis here is that Eva is not beautiful. She's plain, right? She's described here as an ugly daughter, right? Her ugly daughter, Eva. She's the exact opposite of Amy. She's a foil to Amy. But what is emphasized about her? She believes in votes for women. She teaches Latin. And when we get to part 3, right, when the older Miranda, 18-year-old Miranda, runs into Eva again on the train, we're going to see how things have changed, right? Eva, much more complicated figure, Eva seems to have really lived the grand, independent life, a life full of agency that Amy never got to live. And so here, the emphasis is on beauty, right? The value of beauty. Amy has beauty. Eva does not have beauty. And yet, when we get to the final section of the novel, who is it that has really lived the most interesting life? Who is it that Miranda finds more compelling? And we're gonna see in that moment when we get there. It's a complicated sort of ending, but Eva certainly ends up being more than she seems like she's set up to be at the beginning of the novel. Now, there's a passage I want to look at, and it kind of ties a lot of this together, and it's the passage about John Wilkes Booth. And this is where Katherine Anne Porter was really getting into the southernness of her story. So, paragraph that begins with, "There was then a life beyond a life in this world." And again, this is the influence here is that this is the girls have been hearing all of these stories, and it's influenced them. It's made them romantic. "There was then a life beyond a life in this world, as well as in the next. Such episodes confirmed for the little girls the nobility of human feeling, the divinity of man's vision of the unseen, the importance of life and death, the depths of the human heart, the romantic value of tragedy. Cousin Eva, on a certain visit, trying to interest them in the study of Latin, told them the story of John Wilkes Booth, who, handsomely garbed in a long black cloak, had leaped to the stage after assassinating President Lincoln. Sic semper tyrannis, he had shouted superbly, in spite of his broken leg. The little girls never doubted that it had happened in just that way, and the moral seemed to be that one should always have Latin, or at least a good classical poetry quotation, to depend upon in great or desperate moments." Now, Katherine Anne Porter is clearly having a little fun here. You can detect the ironic voice coming through in her narrator, the way she's kind of making fun of the scene. In particular, she's making fun of the romanticness of the scene, the way the little girls are romanticizing John Wilkes Booth, right, in the way he quotes the Latin here. Continuing on, though, let's look at the contrast that develops. Cousin Eva reminded them that no one, not even a good Southerner, could possibly approve of John Wilkes Booth's deed. It was murder, after all. They were to remember that. But Miranda, used to tragedy in books and in family legends, 2 great-uncles had committed suicide, and a remote ancestress had gone mad for love, decided that without the murder, there would have been no point to dressing up and leaping to the stage, shouting in Latin. So how could she disapprove of the deed? It was a fine story. She knew a distantly related old gentleman who had been devoted to the art of Booth, had seen him in a great many plays, but not, alas, at his greatest moment. Miranda regretted this. It would have been so pleasant to have the assassination of Lincoln in the family. Now, this is, I think, a really... Again, you can detect Katherine Anne Porter's ironic voice in the way she's describing how Miranda glorifies John Wilkes Booth. The emphasis, I think, that's important here is Cousin Eva, even though she's the one who's teaching them Latin, she is the realist. She says, no, don't glamorize John Wilkes Booth. He was a murderer, right? Even a good Southerner shouldn't glamorize him. But Miranda can't help it, right? For Miranda, romance is associated with the Old South, right? Romance is John Wilkes Booth shouting beautifully in Latin after assassinating Lincoln. Now, obviously here, right, Miranda is feeling one way about romance, about her family, about John Wilkes Booth. By the end of the novel, she no longer feels this, right? She has transformed and changed, and in a way, she's kind of... Cousin Eva turns out to be right, that we shouldn't romanticize things like that. The trajectory that Miranda goes on is disillusionment with all of these romantic legends. But for now, as a young girl, as an 8-year-old listening to these stories, she is very much taken by this romantic worldview. So then the story itself, right, the main thing that Miranda is taken by is, of course, the story of Uncle Gabriel and Aunt Amy. And much of the first section kind of details their tragic love story. It's tragic because, Aunt Amy is a Southern belle. She's a wild, spirited girl, as we saw at the very beginning. And she seems to have multiple men interested in her, multiple lovers. And, a lot of the first section centers on this particular dispute where one of the men who's courting her ends up in a duel with Uncle Gabriel, or at least Uncle Gabriel challenges him to a duel, and Miranda's own father actually shoots at him and then has to flee for a while from the South. It's kind of a sort of grand, old, romantic, tragic story, a duel over love for Aunt Amy. And of course, even though Uncle Gabriel and Aunt Amy do eventually marry, it ends in tragedy because Aunt Amy ends up dying from a hemorrhage. Now, what's interesting here is the way it's told in the first section. The emphasis is on the romance of her love and her death, and the reality of it, we don't really learn until the final section, when Cousin Eva basically tells Miranda that she's naive to think it was just a hemorrhage. And now the implication of what Eva reveals to her is that in actuality, Aunt Amy got pregnant, and then probably from the other man who was courting her, right? The man who her father shot at, and then died from complications related to pregnancy, right? Complications from potentially a miscarriage of some kind. And so, again, that's the contrast between romance and reality. In this first section, the whole story of Gabriel and Amy is told in a very romantic, old-fashioned cast, like one of these old romances. By the end, we sort of learn that the reality is a lot sadder, right? The reality of what happened is a lot more tragic. So part one of the novel ends with Amy's death. Part two of the novel, we then jump ahead. Now, part two is the pivotal turning point in the novel's structure. This is when Miranda goes to visit Uncle Gabriel with her father, who basically says, let's go visit your uncle at the racetrack. Miranda, remember, at this point is 10 years old, so she's still a child. But what's important here is that this is the moment of transformation, when she sees Uncle Gabriel and realizes he is not the romantic figure from the stories. So let's look at the description of Uncle Gabriel. They had just turned their dollar over to the bookmaker for the fourth race when a vast, bulging man with a red face and immense tan, ragged mustaches fading into gray hailed them from a lower level of the grandstand over the heads of the crowd. "Hey there, Harry," Father said. "Bless my soul, there's Gabriel." He motioned to the man, who came pushing his way heavily up the shallow steps. Maria and Miranda stared, first at him, then at each other. "Can that be our Uncle Gabriel?" their eyes asked. "Is that Aunt Amy's handsome, romantic beau? Is that the man who wrote the poem about our Aunt Amy? Oh, what did grown-up people mean when they talked anyway?" So what's happening here, right? They're seeing Uncle Gabriel, and they see that he's a vast, bulging man with a red face and these immense mustaches fading to gray, and they can't believe that this is the man from all the romantic stories. Again, think of the opening, right? The contrast that was established between the photograph of Aunt Amy and the stories of Aunt Amy. How the photograph did not match with the stories, but when the girls were young, they were able to reconcile it by focusing on the stories, right? By emphasizing the romance of the stories of their aunt. Once again, we're having a similar sort of tension, the tension between romance and realism, the tension between the stories and the reality of who Uncle Gabriel is. If we continue the passage, it kind of goes on. He was a shabby, fat man with bloodshot blue eyes, sad, beaten eyes, and a big melancholy laugh like a groan. So the emphasis here is again on his size, that he's fat, that he's shabby, that his eyes are bloodshot. He's not the romantic cavalier, right, who pursued and courted their aunt in that old Southern romance. He's a man who's gambling his money away at the racetrack, who's an alcoholic, who's a complete wreck. Later, they go to meet his wife, right, the woman he married after Aunt Amy dies. And again, the romance is just sucked out of everything, right? They live in this beleaguered, beaten down house. His wife is not happy with his gambling and with his drinking. Clearly, it's not the sort of romance that Miranda imagined. Uncle Gabriel is not the romantic figure from the first section. He is not who she imagined. And let's look at the way this second section ends, because again, we said it's like a pivotal section in which 10-year-old Miranda loses her illusions about the romance of the past. If we look at the last sort of section here, kind of towards the end, right, she asks her father if Uncle Gabriel is a real drunkard. And her father gets angry, basically tells her, don't ask me that. But let's look at the moment right after that, where her father refuses to answer her question, but let's notice the subtle way that Katherine Ann Porter conveys Miranda's transformation. So it's important context here. At the beginning of this section, Miranda really wanted to be a jockey. That's kind of her childish dream. She wanted to be a jockey. And now it says, there was a respectful pause, as before a public monument. When their father had the heartburn, it was time to lay low. The car rumbled on, back to clean, gay streets, with the lights coming on in the early February darkness, past shimmering shop windows, smooth pavements, on, past beautiful old houses set in deep gardens, on back to the dark walls with the heavy-topped trees hanging over them. Miranda sat thinking so hard she forgot, and spoke out in her thoughtless way. I've decided I'm not going to be a jockey after all. So the decision she makes, right, is that suddenly the romance of being a jockey goes away. And the jockey is, I think, just a small symbol of what she's really feeling. A much deeper sense that the romance of the world is vanishing, that the romance of the world is disappearing. A very small, subtle, and kind of perfect way of emphasizing how she's changing. She no longer has these kind of romantic, childish dreams of what she wants to be when she grows up. So then let's look at part 3 of the novel, set in 1912, right, when Miranda is now on a train going back, right, for the funeral of Uncle Gabriel. And this is when she meets Cousin Eva, who is now an old woman. Now, there's a lot we could look at in this section. This is a really well-done section, especially because Cousin Eva gets a lot of dialogue here, right? A lot of monologuing, right? Where she talks to Miranda about realism. She kind of teaches her that life is not romantic, right? Life is not what she thought. And she kind of sets her straight on some of who Aunt Amy was. So let's look at a few of these sections. Cousin Eva says, "Yes, Gabriel drank himself to death at last. I'm going to the funeral too. I haven't been home since I went to Mother's funeral. It must be, yes, it will be 9 years next July. I'm going to Gabriel's funeral, though. I wouldn't miss that. Poor fellow. What a life he had. Pretty soon they'll all be gone." Now, who's the they she's talking about? The they is obviously people of her generation, right? Her brothers, her cousins, the people she knew from that generation. But I think it's also just a way to refer to the entire generation of that old Southern generation, the generation of Miranda's elders, the grown-ups from the opening section. That's who will all be gone soon. And again, it's this emphasis that Katherine Ann Porter is making here, that this is a novel about the transition between one era to a new era, right? The transition between the 19th century to the 20th century. And Miranda kind of has to let the 19th century go. She has to learn to push away the past, push away those people, right? Remember, at the very beginning, it was emphasized that she felt like she'd lived many lifetimes. She felt like she'd lived many more years than her own because she felt connected to all the people from past generations. But now those people are dying, right? And obviously Uncle Gabriel really symbolizes that, right? Symbolizes that entire generation. And Miranda is going to learn to let them go. And Eva's kind of saying here, yeah, pretty soon they'll all be gone. We learn from this section that Miranda has become more realistic, right? Become someone different than the romantic girl she was. As it says here, so here's how she responds to Eva. Miranda said, "We're left, Cousin Eva," meaning those of her own generation, the young. And Cousin Eva said, "Pshaw, you'll live forever and you won't bother to come to our funerals." She didn't seem to think this was a misfortune, but flung the remark from her like a woman accustomed to saying what she thought. Miranda sat thinking. Still, I suppose it would be pleasant if I could say something to make her believe that she and all of them would be lamented, but, with a smile which she hoped would be her denial of Cousin Eva's cynicism about the younger generation, she said, "You were right about the Latin, Cousin Eva. Your reading did help when I began with it. I still study," she said, "Latin too." So what is the emphasis here? The emphasis is that, Miranda wants to believe that her generation is not going to forget the old generation, that she is going to go to their funerals. But Cousin Eva, she's kind of the voice of wisdom here. She seems to say, no, you will. You will forget our funerals. You will live a long time. She's emphasizing to Miranda that you are a new generation. You don't have to, in a way, come to our funerals. That's kind of what she's saying, and maybe that you shouldn't, that you should separate yourselves from us. And at first, Miranda's trying to deny it. She's trying to say, you know what, we will come to your funeral, but you'll notice she leaves that thought unfinished. But, it's as if she kind of knows that maybe Cousin Eva is right. Maybe there is this break between the generations here, between the 19th century and the 20th century. Now, Cousin Eva then has this speech about what it means to be a woman right after this. And she sort of tells Miranda it's good that she's using her mind, that she's learning Latin. What does she say here? "I'm glad you are going to use your mind a little, child. Don't let yourself rust away. Your mind outwears all sorts of things you may set your heart upon. You can enjoy it when all other things are taken away." Again, what is the theme of this entire novel? The contrast between realism and romanticism, or, as Cousin Eva puts it, the contrast between the mind and the heart. Aunt Amy was the heart. She was the one who lived with her heart, and it killed her. Cousin Eva is the mind. She was never beautiful, but she studied her Latin. She was in favor of women's suffrage, which is something we're going to talk about in a second as well. And she lived. Not only lived, she here seems to be the wise one, the surprising survivor of this generation. If we keep reading, Miranda was chilled by her melancholy. Cousin Eva went on, "In our part of the country, in my time, we were so provincial. A woman didn't dare to think or act for herself. The whole world was a little that way," she said, "but we were the worst, I believe. I suppose you must know how I fought for votes for women when it almost made a pariah of me. I was turned out of my chair at the seminary, but I'm glad I did it and I would do it again. You young things don't realize. You'll live in a better world because we worked for it." So I think this is Katherine Anne Porter, the feminist, right? Katherine Anne Porter celebrating the work of the suffragists like Cousin Eva, who challenged social convention and became pariahs for it, but succeeded in allowing for greater freedoms for the new generation. I think implicitly, right, this is a novel about young Miranda becoming an individual. Young Miranda at 18, by the end of this, as we'll see, becoming an independent-minded person in the 20th century. And I think Katherine Anne Porter is suggesting here that part of the reason someone like Miranda is able to go through this type of independent transformation is people like Cousin Eva, right? People who pushed back against this. And what's interesting here is obviously Miranda, she admires Aunt Amy. She didn't admire Cousin Eva. Her romantic visions were not centered on Cousin Eva, and yet in the end, it's Cousin Eva who was the winner, right? Cousin Eva who actually did change the world, or help change the world in a significant way. So I want to look, though, at the end, because Cousin Eva does not come across as a purely celebrated figure. I think Katherine Anne Porter is too wise and intelligent a writer to turn Cousin Eva into a soapbox for her own views. Because in the end, even Cousin Eva is still obsessed with Amy, right? Still thinks about how Amy was considered beautiful and she was ugly. And even she can't let that go at the end. And I think the really interesting turn that the novel takes at the very end is that even though Eva is right, even though much of what Cousin Eva says turns out to be correct, right? And Miranda recognizes this, she still can't bring herself to totally be on Eva's side at the very end. Let's look kind of towards the end, after Eva has these long monologues about Amy's beauty. So this is a sort of section where Cousin Eva is sort of, talking about, all talking about Amy and sort of getting angrier and angrier as she thinks about Amy. And again, this is, like I said, the intelligence of Katherine Ann Porter. Cousin Eva is also a character. She's also a human being. And she also grew up in this old world, and she is still bitter about having been the ugly one, right? She's still bitter about the way she was treated. And what does she say here? Well, Amy carried herself with more spirit than the others, and she didn't seem to be making any sort of fight, but she was simply sex-ridden like the rest. She behaved as if she had an arrival on Earth, and she pretended not to know what marriage was about, but I know better. None of them had, and they didn't want to have anything else to think about, and they didn't really know anything about that, so they simply festered inside. They festered. And then Miranda kind of starts thinking, based on the word festered, based on this critique of Amy and other women like her. Miranda found herself deliberately watching a long procession of living corpses, festering women stepping gaily towards the charnel house, their corruption concealed under laces and flowers, their dead faces lifted, smiling, and thought quite coldly, of course it was not like that. This is no more true than what I was told before. It's every bit as romantic. And she realized that she was tired of her intense cousin Eva. She wanted to go to sleep. She wanted to be at home. She wished it were tomorrow, and she could see her father and her sister, who were so alive and solid, who would mention her freckles and ask her if she wanted something to eat. So in the end, she rejects cousin Eva as well. And I think that's key for Miranda's development, is that she recognizes that even though cousin Eva was right, and that there was no romance in Aunt Amy, she realizes that even cousin Eva's bitterness is a form of romanticism that she needs to reject. That cousin Eva's vision of this past generation, fueled by this bitterness and hatred, is itself also a form of emotional romanticism that she needs to push away. Because again, if she's going to become an individual, she has to push away everyone from that generation, not just Aunt Amy and Uncle Gabriel, but also her cousin Eva, who represents a different type of adult, a different type of grown-up, but still a grown-up whose values Miranda has to reject in order to truly become an individual, to become a grown-up herself. And so let's look at the very ending. Let's look at kind of the very ending of the novel, right? When she finally gets off the train and she sees her father. And what's important here is that, Miranda is married now, right? She eloped, right? She ran off to marry someone. And she's hoping that her father has kind of forgiven her for this, that her father will still welcome her back. But her father is cold to her. Her father is a little reserved. And this is kind of the final blow here, and Miranda seems to realize that even her father is not going to welcome her back. He'll be cordial to her, right, as they go to Uncle Gabriel's funeral. But she seems to realize that there is this new distance between them, right, between her and her father, that's never going to be resolved, right? That's never going to be crossed. What does she say here? Miranda walked along beside her father, feeling homeless, but not sorry for it. He had not forgiven her, she knew that. When would he? She could not guess, but she felt it would come of itself, without words and without acknowledgement on either side. For by the time it arrived, neither of them would need to remember what had caused their division, nor why it had seemed so important. Surely old people cannot hold their grudges forever, because the young want to live too, she thought, in her arrogance, her pride. I will make my own mistakes, not yours. I cannot depend upon you beyond a certain point. Why depend at all? There was something more beyond, but this was a first step to take, and she took it, walking in silence beside her elders, who were no longer cousin Eva and father, since they had forgotten her presence, but had become Eva and Harry. So what's important here is that Eva and Harry, right, cousin Eva and her father become Eva and Harry. She no longer sees them in relation to herself, but just as two adults, right? Two adults on this path of life. What does it say? It's an important first step for Miranda to take. Again, it's part of the general trajectory. This is almost the very end of the novel where Miranda is becoming her own person. As we said, this novel is a Bildungsroman, a coming-of-age story, as Miranda separates herself from her family and from the past, right, and from all these romantic influences, and becomes an individual. But let's look at the very last paragraph, the final paragraph, right? It's a very long paragraph. I just want to look sort of towards the kind of little bits of this final paragraph. So, Miranda could not hear the stories above the noisy motor, but she felt she knew them well, or stories like them. She knew too many stories like them. She wanted something new of her own. That's important, right? So she's rejecting the stories now. At the beginning, remember, the stories were everything to her. The stories were romance, the stories of Uncle Gabriel and Aunt Amy. Now Miranda is saying no to the stories. She is rejecting the stories of her parents, of the grown-ups, because she has now become a grown-up, and she wants to make stories of her own. Jumping ahead, right, in this paragraph. Oh, what is life? She asked herself in desperate seriousness, in those childish, unanswerable words, and what shall I do with it? It is something of my own, she thought in a fury of jealous possessiveness. What shall I make of it? She did not know that she asked herself this because all her earliest training had argued that life was a substance, a material to be used. It took shape and direction and meaning only as the possessor guided and worked it. Living was a progress of continuous and varied acts of the will directed towards a definite end. She had been assured that there were good and evil ends. One must make a choice. But what was good and what was evil? So she's asking herself these questions that people ask themselves when they're on the verge of becoming mature, when they're in the process of maturing. What is good and evil? What is life and what shall I do with it? I mean, these are the great questions that everyone asks. And what's so beautiful about the way this novel ends is we see Miranda asking these questions just at the moment she's crossing the threshold, right, between childhood and adulthood. 18 might seem like a really young age for someone to run away and get married today, right? Back then, maybe it was less so the case, and certainly for someone from the South, someone raised in this Southern culture. But more important is, the marriage is just a stand-in for something she does that represents, right, her crossing the threshold from childhood to adulthood. But you'll notice the marriage is not even really dramatized in the novel. It's something that happens off the page. What's dramatized on the novel is her thought process, right? Is this mental transformation, this emotional transformation that we witness her undergoing in this moment. This is her crossing the threshold into adulthood at the age of 18. If we read the very last part of this final paragraph, and her disturbed and seething mind received a shock of comfort from this sudden collapse of an old, painful structure of distorted images and misconceptions. You don't know anything about it, said Miranda to herself, with extraordinary clearness, as if she were an elder admonishing some younger, misguided creature. You have to find out about it. So in other words, she's the key line, I think, there is this idea that she receives a shock of comfort as the old structure collapses. The structure is all of the romantic images and associations and misconceptions from her childhood. I just think that's such a beautiful image, a beautiful symbol of what it's like to grow up. The old structure, what does it say? The old painful structure of distorted images and misconceptions collapses, and you receive a shock of comfort. I think that's such a beautiful and profound description of what it means to grow up, of what it means to cross that threshold into adulthood. Continuing on, kind of jumping down a little bit. Her mind closed stubbornly against remembering, not the past, but the legend of the past, other people's memory of the past, at which she had spent her life peering in wonder, like a child at a magic lantern show. Ah, but there is my own life to come yet, she thought, my own life now and beyond. I don't want any promises. I won't have false hopes. I won't be romantic about myself. I can't live in their world any longer, she told herself, listening to the voices back of her. Let them tell their stories to each other. Let them go on explaining how things happened. I don't care. At least I can know the truth about what happens to me, she assured herself silently, making a promise to herself in her hopefulness, her ignorance. So, lots to unpack in that final sentence, but what I really love is, okay, so she describes the legends of the past that she used to be influenced by and enamored by as a magic lantern show. And quite literally, right, she is becoming disillusioned, right, with those legends, disillusioned with the past. And she literally says she will no longer be romantic about herself. But look at that final line. Look at where we end on. She made a promise to herself, in her hopefulness, her ignorance. So we have to kind of figure out what we make of that final word, ignorance. It's almost like Katherine Ann Porter is saying, yes, she has grown up now. She has matured. She has crossed the threshold into adulthood. She has rejected the old Southern legends of her parents' generation. She has become modern, right? She's become a modern person. But she's still ignorant. And I think just that inclusion of that last word, ignorance, beautifully complicates, right, this final stage of growing up that Miranda experiences. And when I read this ending, what's fascinating here is that Miranda is rejecting the past, right? She's rejecting the past. She's rejecting the old sort of stories that she told. At the same time, in many ways, if you think about it, she's not that different from some of the characters that we described in the past. In particular, Aunt Amy. Even though to Miranda, Aunt Amy represented a kind of romance, we never really saw Aunt Amy's interiority. We never saw what she was actually thinking. We never saw what her life was really like. The interiority we get is Miranda's interiority. Aunt Amy, as emphasized at the beginning, is just a ghost. But now look back at the opening, right? Think about the structure. We look back at this opening. She was a spirited-looking young woman. Now, that's a description of Aunt Amy, but couldn't it also be a description of Miranda? Isn't Miranda also a spirited young woman? And so that's what I think the sort of the real complexity of the ending of this novel is, that Miranda is at once rejecting the past and inevitably at the same time, perhaps even unknowingly, repeating the past as well. Because how can we not? To grow up means to reject the grown-ups, right? To reject the world of our parents. And yet, we cannot be totally separate from them. And I think that last word, the word ignorance, right, that Katherine Ann Porter ends her novel with, is, I think, there to get us to question, right, Miranda just a little bit at the end, to inject this last little dose of skepticism. And I think the associations between Miranda and Aunt Amy are not accidental. And to me, I think that's the kind of final beautiful turn that this novel takes. Old mortality, right? It's not just about a modernist woman's rejection of the Old South, but also about the influence of those old legends, the influence of these old characters on someone, even someone growing up in the 20th century, even someone who wants to reject all of those old romantic features. So just to conclude, I think Old Mortality, right, by Katherine Ann Porter, a brilliant little novel, perfectly structured, perfectly constructed, with these beautiful, careful, kind of classical sentences, but with a modern sensibility, right, a modernist sensibility that really emphasizes, right, the development of an individual in all their complexity. So let's wrap up there. Thank you guys for listening. For those of you who have not read Old Mortality yet, I hope this convinces you to read it. For those of you who have read it, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And yeah, we'll wrap up there, and I'll see you all next week. Remember, if you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, share, right? Spread the news about the podcast, and I'll see you all next time.